Good morning. This is Jason Dean coming at you from Film Fanatic headquarters. It's Saturday, about 9:20. We had a nice little snowfall, so it's really pretty out right now. I had a gig last night or yesterday during the day at the Camden Snowball, and it was great. It snowed. It was nice to see actual snow on the ground. The event was with a band with my really great friend Emmett Layler, who was a guest on this show. We did a show a couple months ago where we did kind of a focused show, mostly centered on Stephen King, but we talked about a lot of things in the horror world. Emmett's one of my best friends, and he's an awesome guy. We watch lots of movies together, and movies is kind of what we've always been friends. But when we discovered about 3 or 4 years ago that we had this real mutual love or passion for horror films, it kind of made us. It brought us together. It's really a funny thing. And then ever since then, we've become like movie buddies, and we hang out. And we're actually going to be getting together tomorrow to watch some movies. So it was really great. But he was a guest on the show, and it was an awesome show. And we talked about mostly Stephen King. That's his thing, like his background. He's really well versed in a lot of his books and a lot of his films. And we talked about outside of that lots of different things horror related. But we had a gig. I played a gig with Emmett yesterday. He put together this kind of side project band that's called the Cornbread Muffins, which is it's become this whole like running joke, and it's hilarious, and it's with a bunch of great guys and friends. And we played yesterday at the Camden Snowball, so it was nice. It actually snowed, and it was cool, and it wasn't all. We've gotten virtually no snow this year so far, and we didn't get very much snow at all yesterday, but the snow we did get all stuck, so it's really nice. And we probably only got like an inch or two. And on the way to the gig yesterday, I was talking to Emmett, and I was like, "Oh, this really puts me in the mood to like listen to some, you know, classic old school black metal, which it always does." So, but today's show, I wanted to do. I've been trying to mix up things quite a bit with this channel. Again, the focus is usually always on the majority of the videos is always focused on movies that are pretty obscure, movies in the exploitation world. And actually today, my favorite thing to do on this channel is to do are the interview segments. I love having guests on the show. So today, it's been about a month or two since I've had a guest on the show. So I'm going to be doing a show today with this great guy who is under the name of Method for Madness, or AKA Spencer Roulard. He's a really cool dude, super interesting guy, really talented. I met him a few months ago over the summer. We kind of corresponded a little bit online, and he had seen that I was doing some electronic shows with my band Qauntam, and then he had reached out about maybe us doing a show together. He sent me some of his tracks, and I was really digging the stuff that he was working on. He does all this really great modular synth stuff. And then we kept, in correspondence for a while, and then we met, hung out a few times, and then we talked about doing some shows together. And then we did one big show together, and then we did a smaller show together. And he's pretty phenomenal. And we talked fairly recently, and I'm looking forward to trying to do more shows with the two of us together. So stay tuned for that. And so we talked actually fairly recently more about. He had asked about this channel and the kind of things, kind of the stuff I do, and if I do things with music. And I was like, yeah, music is a huge part of it too. Mostly centered on my electronic group Qauntam, but it's overall kind of approach, or the whole, like, the focus of this channel is movies, obviously. But he was talking about how he's really inspired by certain movies. His music really has a real cinematic quality to it. And we talked in passing about certain films and composers that we both really like and that we really love and that we found to be an inspiration. And he was saying how movies really, there's like a handful of films that are really influential on him as an artist. So we're going to actually do a show together. He's going to come up here around 12:30, and we're going to do an interview show for Film Fanatic. And we're going to talk about, we don't really know each other so well, which I think will make it even more interesting. We just kind of know through each other through the couple of gigs that we've played and just our correspondence. And I just met him recently. Super cool guy. And, and we were talking about, how we kind of got into both of our projects and what was, influential. And like I've said, movies are probably the main source of inspiration for my band Qauntam. So, and he said that there was a handful of movies that really inspired him. So we're going to do a show today. I try to keep the format pretty loose and fun and kind of light, but I like to focus on certain points. So we're going to talk about those films that he is really influenced by. And again, he's a tremendous talent. So I'm excited to see how this whole thing works out. So stay tuned for that. That will probably be uploaded at some point later today or tonight. And so today I wanted to do a show. I've been trying to mix things up also on my own with this channel by doing shows, some specialty shows where I'm focusing on maybe some specific things. I've done a show on film scores and movies specifically for me that have been really inspirational. And I also did some shows where I just focused on. I did a show on Stanley Kubrick. I also did a show on Angelo Badalamenti, my favorite film and television composer of all time, who had just recently passed away. So I've been trying to do these specialty shows. So today's show I'm going to do is just going to be focused on my band Qauntam. It's something I've talked a lot about. It's kind of always in my brain. I always bring it up to some degree in a lot of the videos to, in some capacity, just because of how it just all, for me, it all kind of bleeds together. It's all kind of the same part of the same brain for me. So it's it's just, I can't really have one without the other in a lot of ways. So it's always part of it. But today I wanted to do a show of where I'm just going to focus on Qauntam, and I'll talk about, for what it's worth, talk about, the history and what motivated me to start the band, kind of where the band's gone and kind of what we're doing now, and the kind of how it operates, So yeah, it's been a long journey with this group, because we've been a band. Qauntam has been in existence for about 7 years or so, maybe even more, quite a few years now. And it took me a really long time to kind of get to that point, in my, if you want to call it my career or whatnot, or just in my personal life, to be able to do something like this, to where I, fronted and put together my own like project that became a band that's not just a one-off project or say a recording project, but kind of a living, breathing band that's actually working and playing gigs and is doing things as a regular project. So it's taken for throughout my life, it took me a really long time. And my love, I've always talked about all the music and just from the perspective of being a fan of music and film, I've always been a huge fan of electronic music. My first exposure to electronic music was when I was a kid in high school. I was probably like in ninth or 10th grade. And I grew up in New York in a town that was called Rockland County. And that area had, there was many different ethnicities in my neighborhood. There was a lot of African American, there were a lot of Puerto Ricans, a lot of Hispanic and Spanish folk that lived in my community. So when I went to high school, I had a few friends that were from from Latin America, and a couple of these guys were really into DJing, and we used to hook up and hang out. And I'd go over to their house, and this was when I was a kid, and I was like, probably ninth or 10th grade, and these guys were into DJing, and DJing at the time was something that was like completely underground. It wasn't really a commercial thing, but friends would usually get together at parties and play music, or they'd DJ for themselves. They make these mixtapes and all these kinds of things. And I had a couple of friends that were really into what, eventually became known as like techno. And I had a couple of friends that would make these mixes, and they'd make these mixtapes of all of this kind of underground techno music. Either it was like stuff that they came across through mutual friends, almost like a tape trading thing, or they were actually DJing themselves. They had like real primitive setup with like a couple of turntables or like a couple of cassette decks, and they would, you know, to a degree, make these remixes of music and create these mixtapes. And they used to give me all of this music, all these cassettes of this like real heavy and kind of intense, almost industrial techno music. And also, to a degree, the early stages or forms of what became house music. And house music kind of predated techno by quite a bit. Techno kind of emerged and, kind of out of the late 80s, where house music kind of, came out of almost the late 70s, from mostly like Detroit in the United States. And I remember as a kid being just obsessed with, I got really into that music, and I used to listen to these tapes, and they would always give me my little circle of friends that were, it was like two or three of these guys were DJs, and they were making mixes. They were, they were DJing at parties. They were, making these little mixes on their tape decks, and they had record players, and they were mixing tracks together. They were also like in correspondence with other guys who were out of state, and they were making mixes. So all the time they'd give me these cassettes, and it was all of these different various styles of techno music, and that was my first, kind of interest, or that's what got me into electronic music. And at that time, I was a metalhead kid. I was into, Anthrax and Ozzy Osbourne and Metallica, and typical kid that was into metal at the time. And eventually, my tastes in like heavier music got more extreme, and I got into, uh, you know, thrash metal. I got into, and then, when I first heard Rain and Blood from Slayer, that was my, probably the most extreme album that I had heard. And then from there, I got into even more extreme music. That's when I discovered, and it was kind of the first wave of the death metal scene with Morbid Angel, Obituary, and the music was even more aggressive and darker and more intense. And I got really into all of that stuff. And then after about 5 or 7 years, I got into the first wave of the whole black metal scene, and then that became my probably my biggest love. But at the same time, I was listening to, lots of hip hop. Hip hop was really popular, and also, it was emerging, especially in New York. You had groups like Public Enemy and KRS One. So I was listening to that stuff also, and then with my buddies that were doing these mixtapes that were doing techno, I was listening to that stuff. So I don't know. I kind of always had a pretty open mind, even as a kid, where I was like checking out lots of stuff. But I noticed even at that age, I started to listen to the more electronic based stuff even more. I was diving even. I found myself listening to the techno tapes that I was getting more and more. And the first electronic group I ever got into was Depeche Mode. That was the first album I ever got, that I ever bought as a kid. That was, or cassette that I ever bought. That was an electronic band, and it was Violator. And that album changed my life. All of a sudden, it was like at a new level for me, and suddenly it became a real deep passion for me. But I was still listening to a lot of the same music, like listening to a lot of metal and some hip hop and various things, and rock and roll, Led Zeppelin and Black Sabbath, of course, and Iron Maiden. So I was, always listening to that kind of stuff, but always trying to have an open mind and checking new things out. And was, but I found myself listening to more and more electronic music. And then fast forward years and years later, when I went to, and this was all through high school. When I went to college, and then I went to Berkeley, and my friend Sean Russell, who I've talked a lot about on the show, who who was a get who was a he was a guest on the show last year, and it was a really awesome show. He was a real pivotal figure for me, not only for film, introducing me to film, but then also for introducing me to lots of cool music. And he knew at the time I was really into like techno and Depeche Mode and those kinds of things. So he was really into that stuff, and he turned me on to this whole thing that was called the global underground scene. And the global underground scene was this whole British electronic music scene that was emerging out of England in like the late '90s, early '90s. And Global Underground was a label that was basically it was comprised of or featured all of these various DJs. There was DJs like Anthony Papa, who was like an Australian DJ, Sasha, who was a British DJ, John Digweed, Sander Kleinberg, other groups like Deep Dish. So many groups that Tiesto was another group. And this label, Global Underground, was basically showcasing all of these DJs. And these guys were primarily doing house music. And house music, when I discovered house music, and I didn't discover house music until later. Like I said, my first introduction to dance music was kind of the early forms or the early stages of what became known as like techno. But when I got into house music, suddenly it felt like the music was resonating with me even more. It was more funky and it just had this deeper, sexier kind of groove to it. And then I got into that was right when also Daft Punk had just come out. I did a show way back when on Daft Punk when they had announced that they were breaking up. And I also during that time got turned on through Sean Daft Punk's first album, Homework. That was like this new super cool, like this French house music. And so house music I got really obsessed with. I got really obsessed with Deep Dish, who are these two DJs from DC. They play this real like progressive house music and the music has a real kind of dark, sinister vibe. Another DJ I really got obsessed with was Anthony Papa, who played a lot of like this progressive house that had this kind of darker side. I always gravitated towards the music that had a little bit more of an edge like that. And then Sasha, one of the greatest, one of my all-time favorites. And then also at that time, after we were done with school, Sean and I kept in touch a lot. And he used to live down in Somersworth, or I should say Portsmouth, New Hampshire. So I used to go down there all the time and hang out, and he would always play all this cool music, and that's how I got into groups that were on the Warp record label, which is a real huge label now. They've worked with like Flying Lotus, and then that's how I discovered Aphex Twin. And when I got into Aphex Twin, that was a whole nother level of obsession, and I got so into this music, and it was this really intense, like kind of jungle, drum and bass, ambient kind of stuff. And the first album of his that I got into was Drux, which still remains my favorite album. And then there was another group Sean had turned me on to, which is a group I've talked a lot about throughout these various shows is Autechre. And Autechre is also on Warp Records. Autechre is my all-time favorite band, if you want to call it a band. But there are two guys from London, from England, and they specialize in this really, at times, abstract, but then also melodic and very intense electronic music. Just incredible. And they had an album called Tin Pete, which was a double album and that was the first album of theirs that I had gotten into, and that became an obsession. I never heard anything like it. It was so I don't know, it just had this emotional quality, had this real dystopian vibe. It was very dark, but then it was beautiful. It had, again, this juxtaposition of this darkness and then this beautiful kind of light mixed in. And I became totally obsessed with those guys. And ever since then, I started listening to more and more music and more of this house music, as well as listening to lots of other things. Jazz. I love to listen to a lot of jazz music and a lot of fusion. And I've become, to a degree, equally obsessed as a listener to listening to all of that stuff too. And my two favorite styles are obviously electronic music being the first, but then jazz kind of being, right behind it. And I'm still into like metal and black metal, and I've been on a kick of like listening to a lot of black metal again lately. And but those two styles are particularly electronic music. That's my passion. So, and then eventually I started playing in bands, and I was doing pretty well as far as playing gigs and all of these various things. And for a long time, I was just kind of drum set is my primary instrument. And for a long time, I was basically, kind of a hired person. I would be hired by a singer songwriter or a band to kind of be their drummer, and I would basically just kind of do that gig and hopefully try to do a good job. And then I started doing lots of recordings with different bands and playing gigs. But I was always like kind of a side man. I never really, especially in those early years, I never really had any, I guess you could say, like creative input. I didn't write any music, and I didn't really contribute to the material. I did to a degree because I played drums on the tracks, and I did come up with my own parts. But even in that regard, a lot of the guys I was working with and girls were, wanted specific things on drums, so I kind of did that. And years and years after that, I ended up, having, I think it was like around Christmas time, after doing this, doing these various projects for a while, I had this, around Christmas time, my parents had got me this like really cheap keyboard. And when I first started, my first instrument that I ever played was guitar. I played guitar when I was in middle school and a little bit in high school, mostly in middle school. I played guitar for about 5 years, and I took lessons, but I was a little kid. I wasn't really into like practicing and really developing anything. So eventually I got into drums when I was in high school, and then that became kind of what I ended up doing. And so after, when I was out of school, out of Berkeley, and then I was playing with a bunch of different bands, I was, kind of getting some feet under me or getting some traction. Like I said, I got this keyboard one year for Christmas, and it was this cheap little crappy kind of Casio keyboard. But I started, setting it up in my house or in my room, and I would, mess around with it. And over a period of time, I came up with a couple of these melodies that I thought were kind of cool and interesting. And I was like, oh, this is kind of cool. And then I ended up developing them more, and I started writing lyrics, and I started to kind of write these tunes and these songs. And that was a new thing for me. I was like, huh, what is this about? So I kept chipping away with that. And then when I had this, eventually I amassed this, a collection of these tunes that were still really, really rough, and they needed a lot of work. But I had lyrics written, and I had these, melodies written. I had come up with these drum parts and pretty decent shells of what these tunes needed to be. I had started to work with a friend of mine, Jeff Weinberger, who had a studio and I was also playing music with, I had approached him about maybe getting together and, and maybe like working on like fleshing these tunes out. He was he's a really great musician, amazing musician, really awesome guitar player. And I thought, well, maybe if we work together and I can work with him, because I have had no experience working on music, maybe when I get with him and sit with him, who's an actual guitar player and a melodic player, this can help really formalize the tunes and make them, kind of come to fruition. So he was really into that. We were, again, Jeff and I were playing in a band together, so we started getting together at his studio and we started working. And I would bring the lyrics and the melodies that I had, and I'd be like, okay, this is like what I had in mind, and blah blah blah. And then for parts that I had in my mind about what I wanted to say for the riffs of the guitar, I would kind of like try to articulate to him, and then I would sit with him and he would play, and I would be like, oh, that's kind of what I was thinking, or maybe that's not what I was thinking, or maybe that's really great. Let's put that here, and we would arrange the tunes, and we spent quite a few months doing that, and suddenly these shells and some of the tunes had pretty good structures already, but suddenly with us getting together and we started doing it every week, the tunes kind of became actual songs. So at that point, Jeff and I, had we were suddenly sitting on this material, and I was like pretty excited with it. We we decided to start recording. So we started recording these tracks, and the idea that I had was I was working in probably about 3 or 4 different bands, and all of the guys in these bands I was working with all had these very different backgrounds. And I was looking, to maybe bring a lot of these guys into the studio and record the songs. So it ended up becoming this album that I put out that was called Club Unknown, and I basically, I had a little bit of this pool of musicians that I was working with. I was in this pool with these musicians I was working with, and they were really good and really skilled. They had these different backgrounds. I was listening to a lot of electronic music, but then I was listening to, a lot of fusion music, jazz, rock, and just lots of different things. And I brought all these guys in, and it was totally chaotic and crazy because I had never, you know, done this before, and I was basically hiring all these guys to come in and record. And on every track, there was like different musicians. So I was trying to organize everything, and it was a lot of work. And I know I was really green as far as how to work with people and how to articulate kind of what I had in my mind. But it ended up working out, and it took about 7 or 8 months for us to record the album, and we did it like track by track, and again it was very from a as far as like from an organizational perspective, it was totally chaotic because I was bringing in all these multiple people. So it was like just trying to schedule everybody was crazy, but all of the guys were just amazing and very understanding of me because they knew I had never done this before or taken this kind of risk or chance. And over a period of time, we ended up recording all of this music, and then we put out one album. And it was basically it wasn't going to be a band. I never had the intention of making it into a band. I kind of wanted it to see. I kind of wanted to see if I could, for the first time, like create an album of my own material, and then also like, and I looked at it as just like a one-off, kind of like more of a project studio band. And we ended up recording the album. We got it done, and then it was finished, and we actually got the CD done. We back in the days of, this was a long time ago, so CDs were the only thing that people really listened to, and records and cassettes, but CDs were big then. So we got a lot of CDs done. And again, I didn't know much about the business. Not that I know much about it now, but I used to. We got all of these CDs printed. That was just like an insane amount. Kind of, too many. A couple hundred, I think 400 or 500 CDs. But it was a really great experience, and everybody was pretty excited with it. And then so I had this idea of like, well, we should do, since this isn't a band, and I'm not really thinking about and there were so many different people involved in it. I knew the logistics of that, of making it into a band, would be kind of an impossible thing. But I wanted to do like a CD release show somehow where we could like have a launch party, and we ended up doing that. We had this launch party at the Three Tides, Marshall Wharf in Belfast, and we put together the show where basically all the people that played on the album came and performed. We performed the whole album live, and it was completely insane. Like it was so incredibly hard and stressful, but it all came together, and it was a really great thing to be able to do. And we gave birth to this album, and I actually have a recording of that. I have my friend Charlie Hendricks, who I've talked a lot about on the show. He was one of the artists I collaborated with. We did a couple of songs that were very much on the electronic side. So he was part of the show, and he recorded the show. So I still have. It's great to have a record of that, and so I have a CD of that whole recording. And I listen to that I listen to that recording every now and then, and it's a trip. It's a wild thing. One of the coolest experiences I had, like the album when I first had the album release show, we sold a lot of CDs. But again, it wasn't during the time when there was streaming, and I didn't have the album distributed anywhere. I didn't have it in any stores. I basically just had the albums on me. And but a lot of people came out to the show, which was really great at that time. And this was years and years ago, and we sold a lot of albums. And I remember one of the coolest experiences I ever had was quite a few months after we did that show, and it was after that. That was it. It was like one and done. We never like decided to do it again. But the one thing that's cool, we've done a couple of the songs from that album. We still play now in a couple of bands, and it's kind of a trip, and it's crazy. There's like two or three songs from that album from Club Unknown that we play in Electric Bonfire, which is a band I play in, and it's wild that some of that stuff is still around, and then I think they're good songs, so that they still have some kind of impact on people. And but I remember one of the coolest experiences I had, like quite a few months after we had the CD release party and the thing was over. I had gone to this party, and a few of the people I knew, a lot of the people I didn't know, but I was invited to this party, this house party, and I was going to the party, and I remember pulling up into the driveway, and they were playing music, and there was quite a few people at this house party, and I heard this music, and then I got closer to the door, and I realized they were listening to the album. They were listening to Club Unknown, and it just totally tripped me out, and it was wild, and it was cool. And then I walked in the house, and they were actually listening to the Club Unknown album, and people were dancing and having a good time, and it was a trip. And some of the people didn't know I was going to be there, and it was a cool experience. So fast forward quite a few years after that, again I continued to play in different bands and gained a little bit more experience around that kind of thing, and also tried to broaden my music taste as far as what I'm listening to. And I was also at that time getting back to movies. I was listening or watching lots of movies, and that was right around the time. And this was like in my late 20s, early 30s. I started buying lots of DVDs, so I started becoming a really big movie fan at that time. So that was happening at the same time. And fast forward quite a few years later, I started playing in this band called Full Contact Kitty. And that band was this really, I don't know, arty, weird kind of punk band. We were very much influenced by bands like Sonic Youth, but then we were also really into films, and particularly David Lynch. So the whole visual thing became a big influence, and the whole kind of dark, kind of atmospheric aesthetic became a part of our sound. And we started to use we would do this very theatrical kind of presentation for our shows, where we started using makeup and masks and very specific kinds of things to create this kind of cool aesthetic. And for that band, I started writing music for that band. We started writing, and it was a rock band, but we were going more and more. I had just bought my first microKORG, and we were going more and more into an electronic vibe. Like bands like Massive Attack were a huge influence. one of my all-time favorite electronic groups. But then also the other stuff I was listening to, Alltecker and Aphex Twin and all the house music. LCD Sound System had just come out, and we were really into them. So the music was kind of moving more and more into that direction. And so I was writing some of the music for that band also. And that became a whole new thing of like, oh, okay, I'm like writing music now, and we're in a band, and we're actually like playing gigs. And at the time, I was Diantha Beauvais was the singer songwriter, writing most of the tunes. We were a couple during that time too, and we would get together and have these big writing sessions. So she started off writing a lot of the material, then I started writing a lot too. So the music kind of came out of us working together. But suddenly it was like a band, and it was a thing of where we were actually performing out our own original material. And it was a really great learning experience. And it was really tough because there was no venues that were, going to have a band like us play at, because we were kind of strange and kind of weird and a little bit on the fringe side. But I think it was a really good rock and roll band. But we eventually carved out this little thing, and we were able to kind of create, some success with that. But we had nothing, and we started with nothing, and we really had to, you know, to a degree, fight tooth and nail to build something, and to get our own traction going. And then eventually, when that band kind of ended, I started playing with my friend Charlie Hendrick when we started this band called Tit City. And Tit City was kind of this next level of where everything now for me was I was playing in this band, and that band was pretty much a pure electronic group. I was playing drums in it, and there were other musicians involved, guitar and various other live instruments, some live bass, but predominantly it was all sequence, and it was all electronic, it was all synth. And Charlie Hendrick would sing, and he wrote all the material for that band. I wrote very little for that band. I had maybe one or two songs, but it was pretty much his brainchild. But we did it together, and that was a straight up electronic music. And towards the end of Full Contact Kitties, kind of, if you want to call it, but towards the end of that career of that band, I had just bought that microKORG, and we were starting to experiment more and more with having an electronica sound. So by the time Tit City came on board, or came out of came out of the darkness, we started that band. That was kind of the next level of where that was now a fully realized electronic group. And that band was a lot of fun. Like, it had lots of different influences. But that band had a really good run at one point where we were playing lots of gigs, and we actually recorded an album that was never released and probably will never get released. But we did an album that was kind of unfinished, and it didn't last. That band didn't last all that long. Full Contact Kitty was around for probably 8 years or so, quite a few years. Like, we were a couple for about 9 or 10 years, and that band was a part of our relationship, constantly. And Tit City was around for maybe 3 years, and then that band eventually, a couple of the guys with Charlie moved away, and we kind of broke the band up. And at that time, I started playing in more bands, and there were a couple of bands that I was playing in that were very, very busy, and it was great because I was starting to make a little bit more money playing gigs. And one of the bands that I was playing in, the 220s, that band became pretty successful. We started getting lots of gigs, and that became a thing of where it became a full time band, and I suddenly only had time for that band, and because we were rehearsing all the time, and we were playing lots of gigs, and we were starting to go on the road a little bit, and that band was probably one of the most, if you want to call it that, but probably the most successful band at that time for me. And we had a good ride for a while, but it was also on one hand, like, I wasn't really musically, I wasn't really necessarily contributing to that band. I was kind of the drummer. I was contributing, but wasn't really contributing to really any of the writing so much of the band. And at that time, I started noticing that I was like having all of these creative ideas on my own that I couldn't really express in this band, And then I was starting to kind of feel like I really wanted to try to do other things outside of this band, and that this band became, it was really great, and we had a really great run, but it became this thing of where it became felt too consuming, and that's all, and I felt like that's all I could end up doing. Yeah, I wanted to try to do these other things, particularly around, you know, maybe write some more of my own music, and I couldn't really do that within this project. You know, when I was with the 220s, because I just didn't have time. So eventually, you know, I was with that band for quite a few years, and eventually I kind of left that band, and that band kind of went in a different direction. And then suddenly, I had this totally, you know, I went from being pretty busy with especially them and other bands, but especially them, where it was a full time thing, like rehearsing multiple times during the week, playing every weekend, and lots of traveling, and you know, some gigs became more high profile, and suddenly I had a totally open slate. There was nothing that I was doing. I was in for about 2 years. I was in no bands, like no bands whatsoever. I was home, you know, practicing, playing some drums, and I was just, you know, kind of hanging out. And I just had this totally different life. And I was going through a lot of personal changes too at the time. But suddenly I had this totally open schedule, and it was crazy at first because suddenly I'm like, wow, okay, I have all this downtime. What am I going to do? But then suddenly I got really excited because now I was like, oh, okay, maybe all of these ideas that I've kind of been thinking about, I can try to, you know, make something, you know, with my time. So, and it's funny, I remember back, I was talking about my experience playing with the 220s. There was a time when we were playing in Portland a lot. And I remember one time in particular, which was a real big pivotal thing for me. We were down in Portland, and we got to Portland to play this gig, but we went down to Portland on the early side, like hours before a gig, because we wanted to go to a couple of the music shops that were down there. And I think we went to Guitar Center in Portland, and Guitar Center has changed quite a bit. I haven't been there in a long time, but back then they had all of this amazing stuff that you could play. They had, you know, full drum sets. They had amps, guitar rigs, and keyboard setups, drum machines. They had all of this stuff, but it was all out on display, and you could go in there, and it was like, you know, this kind of like amusement park for musicians. You could go in and test all the equipment and play, you know, and play everything, and spend like a whole day in there, and it was so much fun. There used to be a, like when I went to Berkeley, there was a Daddy's Junkie Music, which was directly across the street, and it was this giant music store, and it was directly across the street. It's, you know, all the kids from the school would go over there and play in there and play all the instruments, and it was like that. But now music shops don't really allow that kind of thing because of, you know, probably a lot of musicians took it to a very annoying level. But and things are very different now. But anyway, we had gone down to Portland early, and we went to the Guitar Center, and we were in there shopping around. Those guys were thinking about buying some new equipment, some new pedals, and I was just kind of walking around, and I stumbled into this one section where they had nothing but Korg equipment. And again, I have my micro Korg, and I've had it for a super long time, probably like 12 years now. But at that time, I still had it, and I used it, you know, like with Full Contact Kitty, and I used it with Tit City, um, and had written some music with it. So they had this big section in Guitar Center where it was just all Korg stuff, but they had a couple of different Korg keyboards, but they had these drum machines that I had never seen before. And I had some experience with drum machines before, like an Alesis 5000 growing up, uh, an SPDS Roland drum machine. I've always had those. Those we used to use a lot, especially the SPDS. We would use that in Full Contact Kitty. We would kind of connect all that stuff up, and we would use that with the Korg. So then that was again, later in that band's career, that became more and more of a sound. And so when I stumbled this into this area, I was like, wow, like, and they had these drum machines, and they were called the Chaosilator, and I had heard about it, and I remember hearing about people saying, and I think I'd seen a video where these people were, and it looked really amazing. It was all this, it was this touchscreen drum pad, and I was like, wow. And before that, when I was in Tit City, in order to kind of get ready for like and getting used to playing, because we used to use a lot of live loops and kind of click tracks live. So I had gotten a little mini drum machine, a Korg Chaosilator. It was a little mini one, and for me to kind of, and I got it for practice, like a practice aid, and it was a really good drum machine. I still have it, and it was like $50, and I used to sit around and practice like creating these loops and playing drums to it, and trying to develop my time more and get used to playing with live loops. I have a headphones on, and I spent a lot of time with that. So I was a little bit familiar with the Chaosilators, and it was a really great machine. We also did use that to a degree in Full Contact Kitty, and it had an arpeggiator in it, and you could create these weird loops. So we used that also in that band. And and at the Guitar Center, they had these giant ones. They had the mother of them, and it was this big giant drum machine, and you could create all these loops, had these presets, and I remember playing it, and I was just like, oh my god, this thing sounds amazing. And I was just like, this thing is so great because you could use it. I mean, the Chaosilator, the little mini one I had, wasn't really something you could use as a featured instrument, because it wasn't really, the quality wasn't really there. You could use it for studio stuff, and you could use it as a side thing, but as far as making it as your main brain to create beats live, like, it just wasn't really, the quality of it wasn't really strong enough. But this thing, I was suddenly like, oh my god, like this, if you had this thing together and you got some really cool beats and you mix this thing together, and you got creative, like, you could use this as like a featured thing. I was just blown away by it. And I got totally lost in it. I was like looping things, and I started to spend all this time messing around with it. And I totally lost track of time, and it was such a funny thing because I got lost track of time. They had these little speakers set up, and you could play, and then I got lost into what I was doing, and I was doing it for quite a while. And I remember, and then I finally stopped, and I looked up, and there was like a group of people watching me play, and they were like, they started applauding me. It was really funny, and it was weird. Like, I had this little audience of people who were watching me play this thing, and they were like clapping, and I was just totally like messing around. And but I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe how cool this thing was. So then when when I eventually left the band, I was like, I want to buy this thing. I want to buy this drum machine. And like, again, I had all this downtime, so I was like, oh wow, I can, I got all this time to do stuff, to do these things, and then I thought, okay, I'm gonna buy this drum machine. So I got it. I got the Chaosilator drum machine, which was like the mother of this little guy that I had, and I started messing around with it all the time. And then I basically got my Korg out, and I put them both together, and I didn't realize that they were compatible. And I was able to put both of the machines together, and I was blown away because I didn't realize that they were compatible that way. Like, you could connect them, and suddenly I was just like, holy mackerel, this is so awesome. And I didn't have speakers, I didn't have a PA. I basically just had those two things, and I'd set them up on my coffee table, and with a set of headphones, and I would just spend hours and hours and hours just mixing stuff, and trying to come up with some beats and some rhythms and some melodies, and I was having a blast. It was super fun, but I spent so much time doing it. But I felt like at one point I wasn't really coming up with anything that I thought was cool, like that was, and again, this was like 6 months into it or whatever of doing that. and I was just constantly like noodling. But then after a while, I felt like I'm not really like getting any kind of, I'm not really developing any material. And again, this goes back to the movies, and I've talked about it with Angelo Badalamenti being my favorite composer. I had at that time I had rented uh, the original season for Twin Peaks, and I watched it, and that gave me this whole like I got this profound sense of inspiration from it, and suddenly I started to create this music, and before I knew it, I had like two or three songs with melodies, and I thought, oh, like this is actually pretty cool. And I had these two or three songs, so I spent a crazy amount of time just working on that over and over again. And then I had this idea, like, what about if I set this goal and I could, maybe do a show or some kind of gig where I play this material and see if it like connects with people, or maybe not, or maybe it doesn't really, maybe I'm not really saying anything. But I thought, well, maybe I can do this. And at the time, I knew a guy who I was friends with who had a radio show, Eric Klausmeyer, on WERU, and I approached him, and he had this really awesome electronic music show. And sometimes they would have guest DJs come in, and they sometimes WRU at that time they would have bands come in and play. So I had this idea, like, what about if I approach him and say, hey, what would you think about, or would you be into the idea if I came and did like a short set of this new material and just see how it goes? Like, I'll do it live, like a live set of this original kind of electro music. And he was totally into it. And so we booked the date, and I booked it like 3 or 4 months out. I wanted to book it far in advance because I I'd never done this before. I never, this was a whole new thing for me, but I really wanted to see if I could do it. And I set this goal for me. So we booked a date, and then I practiced this stuff constantly, and I just worked on it. And then I eventually did the gig, and I played about. I basically came up with the same setup, and I played in the studio live, and I did this like set of about, I don't know, it was probably about 35, 40 minutes of music, and it went over pretty well. Like, it was surprising. I was super nervous. I was super scared about doing it, but I was just like, I just had this need to do it, and I just felt like I should try to see how this works. Maybe it will fail, maybe it will be good. And I did the show, and then I ended up getting all this feedback from people and some friends that were actually, a lot of people were listening to the show. And my great friend, one of my best friends, Mike Whitehead in particular, was like, um, he's like, I think you got something there. I think it's something there's something special going on with what you're doing, and I think you have like a band in the making there, and like you should keep this going. And he gave me a lot of cool inspiration about it. It just fired me up. It totally inspired me, and I ended up getting a lot of feedback from other friends and people that I had played in bands with, and a lot of people had listened to the show. And after that, I was like, okay, maybe I can actually make this into a band, or something. So then after that, I ended up going out and I bought a PA system, bought my first PA system and a mixing board, and tried to figure out all that stuff. And then suddenly I had a full PA here at my house, and I started to work in that capacity. And I started working on different sounds and different things. And then I was thinking of like, what should I call this band, And I was at the time listening to, again, lots of different kinds of music, but mostly electronic music. I was really watching tons of movies, particularly I was, at that time buying lots of DVDs, a lot of sci-fi and horror movies. I was like feeling like all that stuff was really inspiring this music. And like I said about the David Lynch connection with Twin Peaks, that was like the main thing that really inspired it, that made it into kind of a reality. And then I thought, well, maybe I'll call the name Qauntam. And then I came up with the name Qauntam, and then and then that kind of stuck. And I was like, that's kind of a cool thing. So it was fun, and then I was talking to Mike, about it more and more, and I'm like thinking about doing this, turning this into a real band. And suddenly I was working on it more and more, and I had a lot of material. And I was thinking, okay, maybe I can play a gig now. Maybe I can try playing a gig. So I went to this open mic that they had at Fog in Rockland, and I decided to go to it. I had approached them. I approached Ashley Seelig. I didn't know any of them. We had gone in there once after a 220s gig, and that was the first time. Made a little bit of a connection with her, and then so I approached them. It's like, hey, I have this new electronic group. It's called Qauntam, and it's just me. I'm trying to do this like solo thing. Would you guys be into it? And and she was like, yeah, like we have this open mic. Why don't you bring your stuff down here and play, and then if it goes over well, we'll give you a couple of gigs. So I jumped at the chance, and I went down to this open mic and I played, and it actually went over pretty decently. And after that, they hired me. They were like, yeah, let's definitely do this. Let's like make this into a band, or make this like an event. So they were interested in booking Qauntam. And then a couple of weeks after that, I talked to Mike Whitehead again about this, and I was like, this is like um, something now that I think could have happened to where it could be an actual band. And he mentioned like maybe we can play together. Maybe let's try jamming together. And I was like, yeah, because he had just learned how to play bass. Mike is an amazing musician. He's predominantly just an incredible, fabulous jazz trumpet player, but he had just taken up bass. So we got together, and suddenly it was like this thing connected with me. I was like, oh, this is it. Like this is what we should do, and it was something unique and different. So then we became a duo, and we started playing gigs. We started actually playing gigs. We made our we played our first few gigs at Fog, and then we played at a couple of different places, and it kind of evolved to this thing of where it was a band. And also at that time we decided to uh, you know I had this idea of starting a record label. So I started this record label, like this real small independent record label, Berenice Records. And Mike had a recording studio, and we recorded this rock album around that time that had a lot of electronic music, and that was a one-off project, and that went over really, really well. It was the launch of the label, and the tail end of that material was all electronic, and that led to us recording our first. That was like a test run to see if we could turn this into a label and be kind of successful with it and make it happen. So we did this original rock album that had a very kind of Pink Floyd electronica kind of vibe. That was our first album that we put out, and it was also the launch of our label, Berenice Records. And and then we started working on the first Qauntam album, and basically we piecemealed that together. Like we went into the studio without really any ideas of what we were going to do, and we just like did things on the fly and chopped things up and edited things, came up with things on the fly, improvised, and we spent like a whole year doing it, and that became the first album. And then after that, the second album that we did, Digital Palace, we kind of went in with a little bit more of a game plan of uh, a concept and certain ideas for certain songs, and we recorded that album. And at that point, we we started playing lots of different gigs locally, and then we also started playing out of state. We started playing in New York City a lot. We started playing in Vermont. We went to Canada a few times. Played in Connecticut, Massachusetts, and then around here and in New Hampshire. Um, and it was great. Like we were actually like a gigging band. We were playing these different gigs, and we were playing a lot, but just gaining a lot of experience and always trying to push ourselves. And again, the thing has been that the band itself has been such a for me a kind of a dream realized. It was like a this like zeitgeist of or this affects of like my deep love of electronic music and all kinds of music. But like I've said many times, it was the influence, the biggest influence on that band on this band was film. And while we were, when we were starting to play lots of gigs, I had this idea of like, let's try to like, create a cool aesthetic, or like have a, like give people maybe some kind of a visual experience. So I took all those ideas and my love from film, films like Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Alien and Blade Runner were real pivotal movies, and that's where I kind of got the idea of incorporating masks and wigs and lighting and and all those kinds of things. So we started building this aesthetic around our shows because obviously it started with Full Contact Kitty with that whole visual thing with within the music, or with the music. Tit City also continued that. We also had a real visual thing with masks and makeup, and I wanted to kind of do that even more, although to a degree a little bit more subtle, but on a more of a subtle level. But we decided to do it more and have that as an integral part to our band. So we incorporated all of those influences, and I kind of feel like looking back, like all three of those bands are very different, but yet there's all of these, you know, there's a total connection with the sound and how we, how that those bands were run, and the look of the bands, the sound of the bands, and I feel like with Qauntam, it's been kind of the continuation of that, and even more of a realization for me of like a dream I've always had, and to actually make it into some kind of reality. Even if it's on a small level, it's still like a real deep and meaningful thing for me. And incorporating more and more of my film influences, and so it's been also a really great thing of where it's become a thing of where I can bring in other influences that are, say, non electronic music related, jazz, or the band's really incorporated, I feel like, a lot more of a jazz and a little bit of a fusion kind of sound over the years, and Latin music. And it's become more of an open palette. It's definitely electronic music, but I feel like it's become more of an open palette on a canvas that we can incorporate all kinds of music, So that's been the most amazing thing, because at times in the past when I wrote music, it wouldn't be appropriate for that particular band because stylistically it would be a clash. But with Qauntam, it's kind of evolved over the years to where I feel like, well, it has a label to it, of the kind of music it is, but I wanted to have more of an open kind of space where we could bring in influences that were, say, quote unquote, non-electronic, and have those kind of filter through. And I feel like we've done that. And so now, like when I write music, it has lots of those influences, and especially from film scores and soundtracks, and as well as the aesthetics. So it's been really, amazing to see, for me, just the whole journey, and how it's an incredible amount of work and a lot of ups and downs as far as trying to make this thing work, but to be, come to the realization that this is like a really a fully realized band, and it's an actual project that people know about and some people really care about. It's the best thing. It's my favorite thing to do. It's the thing I'm the most passionate about. It's my little baby. So, and I really owe it to a lot of people for making it into a reality, and a lot of the friends and family that support this channel are key figures in supporting my band Qauntam. So it's been a wonderful journey. So I just figured today I would just talk about the overall story, on a little bit maybe more of a focus thing of what the band is and what the band's kind of become, as far as like the history of Qauntam, for what it's worth. So, but thanks again for everybody, for checking out this channel. It really means a lot. And if you like this stuff, please like and subscribe to it. This has been a really great journey. The next Qauntam show is going to be actually next week, Friday the 13th. We're going to be playing at the Poor Farm with my great friend Tom Luther, who's an amazing electronic artist. He's going to be playing with his band Sphere Music, and it's going to be at the Poor Farm. It's located in Warren, Maine, and it's going to be 5:30 showtime. So please come on by if you're around, and stay tuned. There'll be some more events that I'm putting together now. Got a few other things kind of cooking. So Thanks again. So please like and subscribe to this channel if you like this stuff. And have an awesome day. Peace.